In today's video I will try to level up my non-metallic metal skills by painting a Stormcast Eternal in full non-metallic metal, gold and steel.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURES.
I have been painting a lot of non-metallic metals on the channel lately, but I felt that I got a little bit too comfortable with the way I do it and I haven't really improved in a while.
So in this video I will show you how I painted this Stormcast Annihilator in full non-metallic gold and steel to fix two things which I felt I needed to improve in my metals for a while. The loss of color while highlighting up and the lack of secondary environmental highlights.
If I manage to improve these two things, I feel I can get one step closer to painting non-metallic metals like the pros, and if you follow along you can do it too. And we will catch up to Sergio Carvel one day, maybe in our dreams. But enough talking, let's get painting.
Alright, this video I'm going to do a little bit differently than usual, because usually I would write a script for something like this, but because I got a nasty case of the flu the other day and I'm just recovering, I'm going to just try to watch the footage and comment and use this opportunity to actually give you guys a little bit more information than what I would usually do. And if you remember the intro, what I said is that I will try to work on my colors as well as on these environmental highlights, but first let's concentrate on the colors. So the first thing you see me do is to apply this red color all over the place, basically everywhere where I want the gold to be, and the red is burnt red from AK Interactive. And the reason why I'm using this very strong red is because if I think about gold, that gold is usually a rich, like yellow gold with a lot of different colors embedded in it. If you think about gold, maybe it's something else, but that's what I have in my head and that's what I would like to represent on the Mini. But what usually happens when I start doing these large gold non-metallic metal surfaces is that I start highlighting them up and then I lose the color along the way. And that happens because of white, because at some point I have to introduce whitish colors into this because I need contrast. So I need to go from something that is really dark, close to black even, and go up until almost white. And as soon as I put something white on gold, it becomes desaturated, which I don't want. So on this Mini, I wanted to fight this in multiple ways, and the first way to fight it is to start from something that is super saturated from the get-go. So if I have a lot of saturation from my base coat, then when I start to take away the saturation by introducing more white into it later, I will still be left with more than usual. And that's one of the reasons why you see me also doubling down on the layers here, because I really wanted this color to be super saturated, so it needed to cover. So in many places, especially the ones that would catch the light later, I actually applied multiple layers, even though this actually covers very well with just a single layer as well. And that is also the reason why I'm not using the usual whole red, because whole red is much more brownish and it's already less saturated than this red would be, right? So I wanted to switch it up a little bit from what I usually do. And because I was already doing base coating, I thought that I would also base coat all the other stuff, not just the gold. So I used Dark Sea Blue from AK Interactive again, and I concentrated mostly on the elements that were supposed to be steel, but I base coated some other stuff as well, because why not? And this was already a little bit more interesting, I suppose, than just black, because it introduces a little bit of green and blue, and you will see why the green is going to be very interesting later on. And from a point of view of the technique that I'm using, there is not much to it, because I'm just base coating with some base coat consistency paints. I'm just taking it from the wet palette without really introducing too much moisture into it. And I'm just trying to fully cover everything. I'm not trying to leave some of the black behind this time. I'm just covering almost everything. Basically, just take a relatively frayed and big brush and then just go to town. Alright, so I was done with the base coating, and the first color I'm going to be using for highlighting the gold is red oxide from Chimera Colors. And the reason for this is, once again, this quest for trying to make this colorful and not lose color along the way. So I'm just trying to maintain the saturation as long as I can while also going up in value, so basically in brightness. And the other reason why I'm using this color is because I want to use colors that are relatively close to each other, so they can easily blend into each other. As you can see, this red oxide is not that far removed from the red. It's obviously way more orangish, but I won't have to glaze too much to make the transition happen between the two. And this is like resolution, let's say on your monitor, for example, because if there is not a lot of pixels in the image, then it will look jagged and, well, pixelated. And if there's a lot of pixels, then it will look nice and smooth. and detailed. And this is the same with colors. If you use a lot of colors, a lot of gradients in between, then the smoothness is much easier to achieve. If you use only one or two colors, actually 2 colors minimum, right, to glaze from one to the other, they can be very far removed. You can glaze from black to white. It's just going to be very difficult. But this layer is also very important because this is really the first time when I'm defining where to put the lights as well. And on most of the big surfaces, you will see me create this like easy transition from one end to the other. Like for example, on the shin, you will see me dragging the paint from the top towards the bottom. So it's going to be the darkest where I start my brush stroke. That's under the knee because there it's in shadow because of that nice lion sculpture that is the kneecap. And then it's going to be the lightest on this little lip that is right above the foot. And I usually use like 3 ways to determine where I put my lights. And the first one is simply imagination. I imagine that there is a light source, and my light source is usually above the left shoulder of the model. For some reason, I just prefer it that way. And then I try to imagine what the light would actually hit if it's there, and I paint my lights there. And the second, maybe a little bit more realistic way of doing this is to just put the model under a desk lamp while it's black primed, maybe take a picture so that you can later reference it, and then just see where the light spots are and paint your lights there, and it's gonna look pretty good. And finally, the other one that I like to use, which I used here quite a bit, is that even if your paint is matte, like for example the red that I was using was quite matte, you can still see the reflection of the light because you are probably painting under a desk lamp anyway. And you can see it here, for example, if you look at the shin, you can easily see where it's the lightest. So I'm just basically following along and replicating it with my brush. But once I determine where I want to put my lights, I can just basically concentrate on covering most of the red with this orangish color. And I'm going to use a little bit less of it in the shadow areas and more of it, so cover more surface in the areas where I think the light is going to be. And I will just go around the whole model doing this. And once I'm satisfied with this layer, and as you can notice, there is quite a harsh distinction between the 2 colors, the red and the orange. Even though they are quite similar, you can still see this like dividing line, this jagged line that I left behind. So now I'm just creating a glaze and going in and smoothing this out a little bit. I don't have to smooth it out perfectly because I don't want to make it look like it's super smooth, honestly, but I need to make it smooth enough. And creating the glaze is quite simple. I'm using the same blob of paint that I was using to actually create the layers, and I'm just watering it down a little bit more, mostly just leaving more water in the brush. And then I'm removing most of the moisture on the paper towel, and then I'm coming in and dragging the paint from the darker parts, so basically from the red that I left, and towards where I fully covered with the orange, trying to mostly leave this mixture, this glaze, over the dividing line between the 2 colors. And you can do this as much as you want. You can just use 1 layer or 3 or 16 if you want. If you want to make it look like it's perfectly blended, you can do that as well. But honestly, I don't think that's necessary for this project. Alright, and I'm jumping to the next color, which is going to be a mix of red oxide and Sahara yellow from AK Interactive. And obviously you can just mix and match these colors, it doesn't matter which brand you are using, and you can of course use other colors as well, as long as you kind of follow the same idea of trying to keep it saturated. And if you don't want to have this many jumps in color or these tiny jumps between colors, then you can just immediately go to the Sahara yellow. It's just that you are going to have to work much more hard to actually make the transition believable, because it's going to be way harsher than just having this immediate mix between the red oxide and the Sahara yellow. And this is the layer where it's going to get a little bit more interesting for me, because one other thing that I want to also improve is just pure contrast on my non-metallics, aside from the colors and the secondary highlights, I mean. Because one of the things that I constantly mess up is that I just put too many highlights in too many places. And that's just because I feel like I have to. I have to cover everything with everything. I'm sure you know what I mean. If the surface is there and it's unpainted, then you feel that you need to do something with it. But instead of just creating a little bit of texture on it or a couple of scrapes and scratches, I tend to just just almost accidentally cover it with this next layer, and thereby a little bit destroying my contrast. And one way I'm trying to combat this is by using these dramatic light sources. So I'm trying to say that, okay, the light is on his or above his left shoulder, So I'm now going to highlight most of the stuff on his upper left side, and everything that is on the left is going to receive more highlights than anything that is on the right. I mean, right of him, not of us. For us, it's actually on the left. You know what I mean. And you can see this in practice on this face that is on the shield, because I'm imagining that the light is hitting that face from above and from the right, from our perspective. And I'm highlighting everything on that side way more than on the left side. The left side I'm keeping mostly in shadow. I'm still creating all the edge highlights, but I'm not creating these volumetric highlights. I'm not filling in the spaces between the lines as much as on the other side. And I'm trying to do the same thing on the rest of the model as well. So I'm trying to follow through with this strategy to make sure that I don't highlight stuff that I shouldn't. And yet I will do it again, less so than usual, so it's progress, but you will see me in the end. It's going to be a very important part of the video actually, where I go back and I will actually correct it this time, because what I usually do is I just leave the model usually as is after I painted everything, and I'm like, okay, on to the next one. But this time I took my time, I went back and I corrected stuff, and it actually helped a lot, especially with this issue. But other than this little strategy, I'm using this mix to do the usual thing. So I'm edge highlighting everything, because that's the most important thing for non-metallic metal, that you need to highlight almost all the edges at this point still. Like with the previous highlight, I edge highlighted everything, like literally everything that was supposed to be gold. With this one, I'm edge highlighting, let's say 90% of the edges, except the ones that are fully in the shadow, because those ones we are going to take care of with the secondary highlights anyway. So let me leave a little bit more footage so that it's going to be obvious for you what I'm doing, and I will show you then at the end how I'm going to do the glazing step again. And here we are, I'm mostly done with this layer. As you can see, I created once again this relatively jagged line between the two layers, between the previous one and this. And now I'm just glazing in once again to make sure that it's a little bit smoother, the transition. Technique is exactly the same as before, and I will be doing, full disclosure, this thing after every layer, so I'm not going to mention it again, but after every layer you put down, you kind of have to smooth it out a little bit. I mean, you could not do it. It's gonna look quite rough probably, but I think it's always prudent to have at least 1 or 2 layers of glazing in between. And I'm sure you guys guessed what the next color is going to be, Sahara Yellow, of course, because that's why we created the mix with it previously. Now I'm just going to use it pure, and this will be a much bigger jump than the previous mix. So now we are going to start to see the actual effect taking shape a little bit. And what I'm doing with it is basically the same again, mostly, first of all, concentrating on the edge highlights. And you saw me just before actually doing these little dots as well. So that's very important that I'm not edge highlighting everything, and especially not fully. Even if it's a continuous edge, I'm not going to like have to actually edge highlight the whole of it. I'm just going to do like a partial edge highlight and then dot, dot, dots. You know, it's like, that's very dense. It's in general a good practice to create the edge highlights on any element first, and then you can figure out whether you want to fill in some of the lights in between as well, or you just want to keep it with the edge highlight. If it's a thin element, you can just maybe keep it with just the edge highlight, or if you feel that there is space for more highlights and the light would actually hit it there as well, so it's supposed to be there, then you can fill in the highlight in between the edges as well. But especially with this color, we should not be afraid to fill in those highlights still, because we are still relatively early on, but at the same time, this is also maybe our most important layer. This is the most important layer that I put down on this model, because this is going to be my midtone. This is the color that I want the gold to read as. But this is very important to keep in mind as well, that this color cannot be overshadowed later on by any other color, and it also cannot be overshadowed by the shadows, by the way, right? So there has to be more of this than anything else. That's the most important thing to consider while putting this down, right? So whatever comes after, I can cover a couple of places where the sun would hit the most and the material would be sparkling the most, where I fully cover this with something that is brighter, but in most cases, this would and should be visible. And this is actually also very much connected to the goal that I have to keep the colors on the model, right? Because the way you keep color on the model is to keep the midtone visible, because the midtone is the color that you want the model to be, right? So usually I just obscure too much of my midtone. So this Sahara Yellow, this beautiful greenish yellowish color, needs to be visible, and the model needs to read like this is the color that it has, right? With a lot of other color variation and tonal difference and everything in between. So once again, I'm going to leave you with footage so that you can see how I was doing this, especially this, because this is, as I said, the most important layer probably. But one more thing that I will do on top of everything else that I usually do, so all the edge highlights and the volumetric highlights in between, is to make sure that I fully cover with this color. And that's very, very important, because it's not enough if you just glaze over the previous color a little bit and this color shows up. You need to make sure that in the areas where you want this to show up, to actually be the light, that this covers fully. So you need multiple layers. One layer is not going to be enough. And you can also use this to your advantage, as I'm doing here, for example, because the first layer is going to be relatively transparent. Ideally, you are not painting with base coat consistency here. You're painting with something that is in between a base coat and like a glaze. So it's kind of like, let's call it a layer consistency, right? So the first layer is not going to cover fully. And if you then paint on top of that second layer and make that second layer a little bit smaller, that means that you're going to keep a little bit of transparency between the previous color and this one, right? And that will actually help create smoothness, and then it will make it easier for you to glaze over it at the end. And starting with this color, I'm also going to concentrate on creating a lot of little texture between this and the other colors, especially on the larger surfaces, as you can see now on the armor, like graves, let's call them, I don't know. So those things, you can see me creating these little dots and scrapes and scratches. And that's for two reasons. One is because it's going to make it easier for me to blend the two colors later on, especially on these, once again, large surfaces. And the other thing is that it will create texture, so it will make the model look more interesting and the armor look a little bit more worn and realistic. And of course, because this is the most important layer, this is also the most intricate and requires the most amount of time as well. And it would be impossible for me to leave the whole thing in, because then it will be a lot of footage, I would say. But if you guys are interested in seeing the full footage at some point, let me know in the comments, and I might find a way to do something that maybe in the future, if that's the thing that you guys want. Or if you feel that this is way too long and you want to see something that is way shorter, then do let me know as well in the comments. All right, let's take a break from all the yellows a little bit, because our dude already looks kind of like I want him to look a little bit, but obviously we need to work a lot more on this metallic effect. But what I'm doing now is actually the second part of our strategy, and the second thing I wanted to change in my non-metallics, which is to add these environmental lights, these secondary lights into my non-metallic to make it more realistic and, well, just cooler, I guess. So you see me doing these like green effects at the bottom, which is done with fallen grass from Chimera Colors. This is a nice desaturated green, and it's relatively dark, but not too dark. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to represent a bounce light from the ground. And for that, obviously, the ground needs to be green, and we will take care of that with the base later. And the way I'm doing this is I'm essentially highlighting the same way as with the gold, but reverse. So I'm imagining that the light is coming from the ground up, which it actually does, right? So the light comes to the ground, hits the green grass, bounces back, and then it's reflected as green on the relatively shiny gold armor. That's the idea. Well, I'm saying grass, but I will actually make it into a swamp. So it's not grass, it's just the color, the name of the color that I'm using. But the idea is the same, right? And the most important thing here that I was trying to keep in mind is to not fully obscure the original red. So, because then the shadows would be gone, right? So this needs to kind of go, either replace the shadows a little bit where there are none. Like, for example, on the shin armor, like I'm painting it over a little bit the yellow that I painted yellow before, and now I overpaint the green on top of it. Or it goes in the middle of this red shadow that I had before. So the idea is actually quite simple, because we already created most of the prerequisites for this. Like all the dark shadow areas where I felt that there wouldn't be any light hitting is exactly where this should go, or on the transition between this and the yellow, really, right? And it also goes onto the edges, as you can see here, that are pointing downwards. Even if it's an edge that is relatively high up, you can still basically create an edge highlight, but in reverse. So not on the top edge, but the one that is facing the ground. But in general, I try to make it so that it's more pronounced on the things that are closer to the ground, because obviously they would be reflecting the ground more, or at least it's obvious to me. Maybe that's not true, but I think it looks quite good as it is. All right, let's leave the green alone for a while. We will come back to it later, but let's now move on to highlighting the armor even further up. So I'm going to add some cold yellow into the Sahara yellow, and the reason why I'm doing this is because I still don't want to introduce anything that has a lot of white in it. So this cold yellow is still very yellow, and it's not going to be a huge jump in terms of the value, but it will help me blend things a little bit further and add even more saturation, because it's so nice and sun yellow, the combination of the two. And the way I use this is quite standard. So once again, a lot of edge highlights and highlights in between, but only inside the previously established highlights with the Sahara yellow. And obviously I want to do this less than the Sahara yellow. So the previous layer, as I said, needs to be fully visible. So I'm reducing the size of my highlights quite a bit and concentrating them mostly on this right and to the top kind of philosophy that I had in mind. Once again, you can see this on the face. I barely use any on the left side of the face, and I'm concentrating most of these highlights onto the right side of the face. next up is Cold Yellow Pure, and this one is getting like really like towards the end now. We are almost at the point where I'm going to introduce the white, and that's going to make a big difference in this whole thing. But for now, I'm just going to enhance my highlights further. And as I said in the very beginning, this just allows me to blend a little bit more, because the more colors I put in between the two endpoints, so the darkest and the lightest, the more blended this is going to look in the end. That's why I'm adding all these colors and even the mixes of the two colors. So after the cold yellow, finally it's time to introduce some white into this equation, and that's gonna be Sunray this time, which is kind of the equivalent of ice yellow. And just watch what's gonna happen, because this is the thing that is gonna sell our effect or not, right? Like, this is also the thing that you can easily overdo, because if I do too much of this and I cover too many of the previous layers, then the whole thing just becomes washed out and white, and it loses saturation, and it's not going to look like metal, it's just going to look like a hot mess, right? And well, you can still tell me in the comments below in the end if it still looks like hot mess at the end, but we shall see. So the most important thing with this is to make sure that you only put this in the actual light areas. Once again, using this face as an example, I'm only going to use this on the right side of the face, and especially concentrating on the upper right side of the face and all the things that are pointing up or towards the light rather, right? Also making sure that I'm not covering almost any edge fully with this, because it has to be a really tiny edge if I cover this fully, because it just would obscure all the other colors that I already used on that edge, and I cannot do that, right? So the most important thing is restraint with this one. Less is actually more, and that's the most important thing to remember when it comes to applying the white in the non-metallic metal gold. And I'm not just preaching this to you, I'm preaching this also to myself, because I keep forgetting, because I'm just too much in the moment, and you know, I see a surface, I paint that surface, and that's a nice mindset, but it doesn't serve me very well when it comes to selling metallic effects. One interesting aspect of this white painting part, or like this stage of the painting process, is that unlike the rest, you don't want to fully blend this white into the previous layer. It actually helps you, at least in my experience, if you leave this a little bit more distinct, and like there's a harsher transition between this and the previous layer. Because for the non-metallic to look metallic, you kind of have to create big jumps in contrast. And this white is actually exactly doing that, especially if you make sure that it fully covers in certain spots. Just remember once again to not obscure too much of the previous colors, because you still want more of the yellow or the yellows and the reds than this white in most places. There can be a couple of places where you want to have more of this whitish color because it's so bright, but in most places, whatever the surface, you need to keep most of the surface yellow and red and green a little bit, in this case, for example, but not obscure it with white fully. Just remember that. I keep telling myself. All right, and we are at the final step, and this is applying pure white. And this is definitely not something that you want to apply on full edges or any full surfaces, really. You just want to have tiny amounts here and there, maybe like a little bit of an edge, but mostly just small dots of pure white, relatively thick, because then it covers fully and it really sells this glinting, sparkling effect. If I showed restraint with the previous color, then here I'm just like, just dots, really, like barely anything, because if you overdo this, this is going to overpower the whole thing, and it's not going to look like it's sparkling, it's just going to look like it's white. And I know that it feels like you need to do more, right? Because this barely shows up, but that's enough. That's exactly what it's supposed to be doing. So once again, note to myself, make sure that I don't overdo white at the end, because I used to do that all the time. Once the gold was finished, I decided to go back and work on the green a little bit. So I mixed in some sun ray into the fallen leaves. And the idea was that I would just highlight it up kind of the same way I would do anything else. So I would just like leave some of the previous darker color behind, and then I will add this on top. And I'm a little bit torn on this. I should practice this a little bit more, because in some places this actually looked quite good, but in some others this actually made things worse. No worries though, we will correct this at the last stage anyway. Alright, let's put the gold aside a little bit. I will get back to it later at the very end, but now it's time to paint some steel non-metallic metal. And once again, I'm going to do something weird. I'm going to just base coat everything with dark Prussian blue first. And the reason behind it is basically the same as for the red, because I want to once again work on this colorfulness of the steel non-metallic metal, which is a bit weird, right? Because in order to make it steel, I have to make it desaturated. But at the same time, I also want to keep some color. So let's see how that works out. And by the way, I'm going to keep the shoulder pads also blue. That's why I'm also doing them in the same color, but they will look very different in the end, even though they start from the same color. There is one slight difference from the red. This is not going to be used to cover everything fully. You can see this on the shield actually, because I'm going to keep the parts that are closest to the ground black, so that I create more contrast, because I will be coming in with the green anyway. And here I already kind of know what I'm doing compared to the gold where I was using this for the first time. So here I just preserved the black a little bit more and just concentrated the blue on the top part of the shield. And once I was done with the Prussian blue, I went with anthracite gray, which is I think way more expected than the Prussian blue, because it's a standard color that I use all the time for non-metallics. And I thought that this would be perfect here as well, because it's a nice transition from the pure blue. And it goes into this desaturated range where I need to be in order to sell this as steel, because you need to really desaturate the colors in the end to create something that looks steelish. And we can consider this kind of the equivalent of the Sahara yellow that I used on the gold. So this is going to be the main color of the armor. The blue is the shadow, and this is going to be the mid-tone. So the order of the day is to paint this in the highest quantity all over everything. So this is going to be more present on the steel than any other color, ideally. And then I need to preserve it, make sure that I don't fully obscure it, because otherwise, once again, we are going to lose the color from our steel non-metallics. But while I was doing this, I was so focused on making this the mid-tone and the color that is everywhere that I actually made it everywhere. And that's a mistake, right? Because if you remember what I did with the shield and the rest of the gold parts, is that I made it so that there is more light on the right. And unfortunately with this one, I did not observe that little rule that I created, so the light is not as dramatic as it should be. If you look at the lion, the face that is on the torso or the chest piece, you can see that it's highlighted almost equally on the left and the right, and it should be highlighted more on the right. So I will have to correct that later. But other than this, it's gonna go exactly like I did the gold. So I will just edge highlight everything, including the little text that says Sigmar on top of the shield, which is kind of cute. But all the other edges as well, as you can see. And then once I have all the edges highlighted, I need to figure out whether I want to create more highlights inside the two edges, if there is space for it and there is need for it or not. But the edges need to be highlighted for sure. It's also interesting that unlike on the chest piece, I actually did not forget the dramatic lights on the knee, the lion head on the knee, because there I guess it was more obvious that it's going to be in the shadow, and I wanted to come in with that green shadow highlight or environmental highlight later on. So here I did it correctly, but on the shield, once again, I'm going to be doing the mistake and I'm going to just like highlight it everywhere and not just on the right. And now, because we are done with the midtones again, just like after the Sahara yellow step, I'm doing this after the anthracite gray step. It's time for those environmental highlights again. And I'm using the same green, and I'm going to use the same kind of approach as well, where I'm highlighting everything but in reverse, so from the bottom to the top. And those indentations on the shield are actually a perfect example for this, because they would be hit by the light in a weird and very interesting way. Because if the light hits from the top, it would hit this bottom lip, the bottom edge of that indentation, right? Not just the edge, but also a little bit of the surface leading up to the edge. And then any bounce light that is coming from the bottom would do the opposite. So it would actually hit the top edge from the bottom and a little bit of the surface leading up to it. So basically the bottom part of that indentation should be gray, anthracite gray, and then the top part should be green. But also I need to keep in mind that I'm not just doing individual indentations kind of without context, right? Because the bottom part of the shield would need to be more green than the top part. So on the top part, maybe I would just do a couple of edges, some of these top edges of those indentations. But at the bottom, almost everything should be green, because that's way closer to the ground. It's kind of in the shadow, so away from the sun, because it's kind of leaning back as he is holding it. So this is also very important to not just look at individual elements, but the larger surface as well. And with that done, let's get back to the grays. And this time I'm going to use gray blue. And this is going to be the next step after anthracite gray. And this is the equivalent of kind of like sunray and the gold part. This already contains a lot of white, and after this step, the non-metallic metal effect should kind of be obvious, hopefully. And once again, you can see me forgetting about this idea of the dramatic light that I had in mind, and I am going to be painting the whole lion's head the same, kind of on both sides, and then I have to correct it, which is fine, of course, but it would be nicer if I actually remembered it while I was doing it, so keep that in mind better than I do. Also, one can argue that I overdid it a little bit on this lion's head because I obscured too much with this color, even though that thing should be really shiny, especially on the right side from our perspective. But still, I could have kept it a little bit down, the amount of brightness, and I think that would have served me better. And the next color I'm going to be using is pale blue, and this is a very, very white color. It's almost pure white, actually, in how it looks when you apply it to the model. And once again, the most important thing here is to not obscure too much with this, except in places where it really needs to shine. Right? If I obscure too much of the blue or the previous blues with this, then the whole thing is just going to look like it's just white in the end. But other than that, this is basically the same as before. So lots of little scratches and dots to create noise. And then lots of edge highlights in strategic places though. So don't use this everywhere. This is at the final stages of the non-metallic process, so only in the places where the sun would hit or the light would hit, and even there sparingly. And yes, I can still go up in brightness without actually hitting pure white, although, well, technically this is pure white with a little bit of blue in it. So I'm going to use snow blue, and this is going to be our final highlight, to be used only in the most strategic places, so I should not be using it on the left side of the shield, but oh well. I will correct that later. So only a couple of edges here and there and a couple of corners. Don't overdo it. Very, very important at this point. And of course, it would not be complete without a couple of small dots of pure white, because you have to have a couple of dots of pure white on your non-metallics. And with that, we are done with the non-metallic metals, but I wanted to show you one more thing, which is kind of related, let's say. And that's how I painted the hammer. And after that, we can look at the base, which is going to inform our choices when it comes to these gold environmental lights. And finally, I will show you the final little touches that will really change this up quite a bit, actually. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time doing this. I will just give you this recipe because it kind of goes together with the armor, I guess, at least in my head, although I didn't really create any OSL effect or anything like that. So what I wanted to create, as you can probably see from the thumbnail, is something like a lava effect, you know, this kind of like magma thing glowing through the cracks of the hammer. So what I did here is that I base coated most of the hammer in the same red that I used under the gold as well, so burnt red. Then I mixed in some medium rust into the burnt red, and I used this mix to stipple it in the middle of each of the, let's call them surfaces or facets of the axe. So all sides, but also each individual segment as well. But let some of the red be seen still on the sides, right? So this shouldn't obscure entirely what you painted before. Then I use medium orange to do the same, but now inside the previous mix, right? So I didn't touch the red, I just touched the orange color that I created right before. And finally, I added some light orange right in the middle of it. All right, now I mixed in some black with my original burnt red, and I used it as a glaze, and I glazed it towards the sides, towards the edges of each of the little segments of the hammer. Ideally, once I'm done with this, each of the edges of the axe should be fully covered in this. So they should be dark. All the edges should be dark. As the next step, I'm going to be doing the same thing, but now with pure black. I just need to be careful not to overdo this so that I don't cover fully what I did before. This needs to really just go towards the edge. So it's just an edge highlight with a little bit of excess surface leading up to it. Alright, so the hammer already looks quite good, but it's time to make it look even better. I'm going to be using dark sea gray, and I will create a little edge highlight, a thin edge highlight on every edge. You can probably guess why we are doing this. The idea is that the hammer is the hottest at the middle point, right, on each of the segments, and then it's cooling down towards the edges, and like the very edge is like basically steel, it's cooled down, that's why it's gray. And as a final touch, I'm going to be using some medium gray on just some of the most prominent edges and corners to make them look a little bit better. And that's it, that's the hammer done, and it looks quite okay for the effort that I put in, I think. Before I show you how I did the base, let me tell you how I did the final touches, because I was talking about this quite a bit throughout the video that I needed to fix a couple of things, but that's also quite natural. Whenever you finish a project, you have this tendency to just like put it aside, it's done, I don't want to touch it, I don't want to make it worse, right? But that's actually very unlikely. If you manage to make it as good as it is, then you're probably not going to make it worse by correcting a couple of mistakes. And the first thing I did here was black lining, which is something that I think is the most obvious and easy way to make your mini better. And most people could just make their minis better by doing this, honestly, after they're done, or even in between steps, I guess. Right? Because it's very likely that by the time you finish, you are not going to have all your shadows intact. Not everything is dark where it should be like dark. So you can just correct that, like you see me doing here, where I just overspilled the brighter colors into these crevices where it should be completely dark. So I'm just correcting that. And there are other very obvious places where this happens as well. For example, these little bolts, which I kept making brighter and brighter on the armor, they are very likely to lose the underlying shadow. So when you're finished with the model, you can just go back and create a little shadow under each of them to make sure that they stand out more. Another obvious place is when two armor panels meet, or where two elements meet actually. The separation line should be always dark. And you can see this on the foot, where those like overlapping elements are not as dark initially as they should be, because I probably overspilled a little bit of bright color while I was painting. So now I had to correct it. But in general, these dark lines are just as important as your highlights, because if you don't have these to go together with, let's say, your edge highlights, then it's much more difficult for the eye to see where one element begins and where the other ends. So you are not going to have such detail on the model from the perspective of the viewer. But fortunately, these are much more easy to fix than your edge highlights or your highlights in general, so it's always worth coming back at the end of the paint job and see if everything is intact. And just by recreating these or fixing these, you can actually create a lot more contrast on the model than you would think. The other very important thing that I did in the end was to tweak my non-metallic metals a little bit, especially in the shadows. And I was using dark sea blue and whole red for this in various places. So the dark sea blue mostly went into places where I was using this environmental light, because I wanted to use it to smooth it out a little bit, but also to darken it down a bit. Usually I have this tendency, as I was talking about it throughout the video, that I over highlight stuff. So in the end I can just go back and use a thin glaze of this really dark color with some interesting tones in it to tone it down, to make sure that wherever it should be darker, it is actually darker. I don't have to just accept what I did with my highlighting. I can go back and, you know, make it a little bit darker than it actually is. And the shield is a good example of this, because at the bottom it should be really dark, but it was also a little bit too scratchy and not smooth enough, so this helped me fix that. But there's also the lion's head, which at the bottom was a bit too bright, so I'm fixing that, but it was also the same kind of light across the left and the right side, and I wanted the right side to be way more light than the left one, right, from our perspective once again. So you see me working on this left side, because anthracite gray and dark sea blue go so well together. I can just kind of use this one color, dark sea blue, to just go back to this original mid-tone almost, and make it a little bit more interesting, maybe in terms of colors as well, because it has a little bit of green in it as well. So it also synergizes well with the green environmental light. And then with the whole red, I was doing the same thing, but for the gold armor. And this didn't need as much fixing, in my opinion at least, so I didn't have to use it as much. But especially on the shield, I felt that there was a little bit like of a problem on the left side of his face, because I messed it up a little bit when I was painting the steel around it. So this was my way of fixing it, and also creating a little bit more contrast by darkening it down. But I also used it to darken down some of the shadows a little bit more, because I felt that I went a little bit overboard with the highlighting, especially because, once again, the light should be coming from the left, and I wanted to make it so that everything on the right is a little bit darker because of this. Alright, before we finish, let's talk about the base a little bit, because this time it's actually important, since it goes together with what I did with these environmental bounce lights. Because of how I did those lights, now I have to make sure that the base fits the bill actually, and the model and the base kind of go together. Originally I had the base covered with some basing paste from AK Interactive, I think, like Muddy Ground or something similar. And now I'm just applying a dry brush of German Field Grey on it to lighten it up. And once I did that, then I went with the same Fallen Grass from Chimera that I used on the armor as the highlight, and I'm dry brushing that, but leaving some of the previous German Field Grey still visible. And of course the reason I'm using this color is because this is the one that is reflecting on the armor, so now the ground actually matches the color on the highlights of the armor. But at this point the base looked a little bit too simple and nothing like the swamp I envisioned, so I decided that I needed a bit more color. So I went in with Plaguebearer's Flesh. This is a contrast paint from Citadel and one of my favorites, and then just added a little bit here and there just to break up the colors a bit. And finally, to finish it off, I used Puddles, which is a diorama paint, or, well, more like a product, I guess, from AK Interactive, and I use this to make it look like it's like water, like glistening, because this thing just creates this really murky water effect. And this is it, that's the model done, and I hope I managed to fulfill my own expectations and created something that is really colorful and non-metallic, and also managed to create these environmental lights a little bit, placing the model in its own environment. And it looks like this on the turntable.
Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you actually learned something new, and if you did and you got this far, you probably liked it, so maybe give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There's more where this came from. See you in the next one.